Hello, friends. Welcome back to the School of Self-Worth. I'm your host, Nicole Song. Today, I have a really special guest here for you. And the conversation that she and I had really gives me so much life and energy. It's the reason I love hosting this podcast so much because I get to talk to such smart, intelligent women. And today I'm so excited for you to connect with Mary Beth Rodriguez. She is a woman after my own heart. She left her job in the food styling world and a career in the food styling world to start her own business with Ritual, which is all about helping women connect more with having modern rituals so they can have more ease and grace in their daily lives. So her products are totally beautiful. And Mary Beth herself is such an incredible human. We did things a little differently in this episode where I interviewed Mary Beth and she also interviewed me. So we had this really wide ranging conversation during this episode about what it's like to be a woman of color in industries that are not as diverse, what that experience is like, as well as the experience of leaving a corporate world to go into your own journey of having your own business, turning your side hustle into your main job. So we had just a really incredible conversation that I know you will get so much out of. So make sure to stay tuned for this episode. And if you're an Asian American woman who wants to get promoted in 60 days using the new visibility system, DM me new on Instagram at Nicole Song. I have got something for you. Okay, friends, let's dig into this incredible conversation. Mary Beth, welcome to the School of Self-Worth. It's so awesome to have you with us.
Thanks. It's great to talk with you, Nicole.
Yeah, and we had just sort of like a preliminary conversation, which
Mhm.
was so rich and so deep that I'm just really excited to have the conversation today with you. And then for all of you listening, today's format will be a little bit different because Mary Beth is great at asking questions. I like asking questions. And so I think we'll just be going into more of a flow this way today. And I am just excited to have it because I think what you and I were talking about, Mary Beth, both
Mhm.
as Asian American women and the experiences we had in workplaces and in life really informed a lot of how we got here. So that was where I think we will head that direction. But first, let's start by just having you share a little bit about your background. Like, tell me a little bit more about yourself and so people can get to know you.
Yes, I feel really lucky. I've had such a great career. I went to business school and culinary school. I worked as a chef and a food stylist and a cookware buyer, and then in the corporate world for a while at some food startups. And while I was working in the corporate world, like we talked about before, I had a health scare in my mid 30s that really made me take a step back, kind of reassess where I was with my wellness, and I started adding some great daily rituals in my life, and that inspired me to start a wellness company called With Ritual. So I've been on the entrepreneurial journey for about a year now. So it's been really rewarding to be on this journey. So I feel lucky.
Yeah, amazing. Well, I want to hear more about your company, but I'm curious for you if you could talk first about what was it like really the differences you're seeing from being in the corporate world and moving out of that world, and especially food styling, and then
Mhm.
also food in general, which I'm curious about, to the world that you're in now. But like, what are the biggest things that you're noticing?
Wow, that's a really good question. I feel like when I was in the food world, it was a little bit earlier in 2000s, and it was really hard for women at that time. There really weren't a lot of women for us to look up to. There weren't a lot of Asian American women, and it was very traditional. We all looked up to the same chefs and who did the same thing. So it was really about, it was hard to find your voice and feel that you can express something different and unique to your culture and your heritage and your point of view. So I think it took me years really working through being a chef and being a buyer and finding my voice in the corporate world to allow me to be an entrepreneur, because I think it's really about um, just learning like to be quiet down and listen to your own voice. And I know you've had the experience with that as well, which I love to talk about. Like, how do you listen to your own voice and
Mhm.
express your unique point of view, being like an Asian American woman in the corporate world?
Yeah, totally. And I want to talk about that. And I want to ask you one more question and I will answer that. When you say like you weren't able to really express your voice in food, was it like cultural? Like, was it around the types of food that were being created? Because I feel like now it's really different in
Mhm,
the food world, right? Like,
mhm,
people are really open to, I mean, there's still people out there who haven't really heard of like different kinds of Korean food. And like, I
mhm,
am obsessed with Korean food. So, like, I know, even though I pronounce it very poorly, but like, I'm obsessed with all kinds of Korean food. But
mhm.
like, would you say like back then people were much more in like sort of the straight, old school style of like what's popular, contemporary. Like I figured probably like new American, European takes on food.
I think the big difference was when I was coming up in the early 2000s, it was kind of like Korean food was a novelty. Do you know what I mean? Like certain Japanese food, it was very much a novelty that people would say, like, I'm going to use a certain ingredient from this Korean cuisine and add it to like a European fine dining cuisine. So it was kind of like you used ingredients from Asian cuisines, but you always did it within the context of like a French or classical cuisine to make a fine dining. And that's what fine dining was. And now I think it's so great. I mean, I live in Chicago. We have a Michelin star Filipino restaurant. So now I think younger chefs are coming and saying, you know what? I don't have to use it within like a French context. I can actually use French context, but use it through my cuisine and
Mm.
make that the star. So it's really about, as opposed to being kind of like the side like little accent flavor, it's like I think now you can be like the main ingredient to your cuisine and to your point of view, which is what we're seeing so much now in chefs, which is really great.
Totally. So then they're just like a lot of them I know have probably classical backgrounds for
Mhm,
school, but they
mhm.
just kind of dabble it in there, but they're
Yes.
still using the foods that they grew up with or that they ate and knew as
Mhm,
kids.
mhm.
Yeah. Oh, that's super interesting. I mean, I love food and I feel like I could talk about it forever, which is why
Me
I
too.
had to get that question in before I answered your question. But yeah, I'll talk a little bit about finding voice. I feel like
Mhm,
for myself, I don't feel like it's interesting you ask it that way because as
mhm,
a journalist, like that's actually a really important thing is to your writing voice. But
mhm,
I still feel like I never like I really struggled with that when I was a young reporter. Like my
mhm,
editors would be like, okay, there's like no voice in the story. And I'd be
mhm,
like, but we're supposed to be objective. Like, what are you talking about? And like I really didn't understand that when I was younger. And
mhm,
then the more I learned to develop my own voice as a writer, I feel
mhm,
like that really helped. But it wasn't necessarily I feel like I didn't really find my voice as a person and human probably until after I left journalism. Like I think I
mhm,
found my voice within my writing when
mhm,
I was a journalist, but I didn't necessarily, I think, have total ownership of who I was in
mhm,
that context because I was still trying to please people. Like I still wanted my editors to like me. I
mhm,
still wanted to get on the front page. Like I still wanted to be considered good at my job.
mhm,
Whereas when I became a yoga teacher, it was very much about being yourself. Like that's literally, and I remember when I first started training to be a yoga teacher and they're like, okay, like you have to be authentically yourself in front of the room. And I was like, is this a job? Like a job where you actually are just supposed to be yourself? Like that seems weird to me. Like I don't, and I also thought it sounded like the best job on the planet because
mhm.
I just had never even considered that I wasn't myself
Right.
until I started teaching yoga. And then I really had to push myself because what happened is like I would stand in front of a room and I would be teaching certain poses, but
Mhm,
and I experience this to this day in classes, like the teachers who are really who they are,
mhm,
like their personalities or they crack jokes or like they don't take themselves too seriously are the best teachers because they are
mhm,
being themselves, but they've also really honed their craft at the same
mhm,
time. And so I kind of think of it that way. And then I feel like as an entrepreneur, I've definitely had to develop it a lot more because being an entrepreneur requires you to put yourself out in a much bigger way, much more consistently, whether it's social media or trainings or, on a podcast or whatever it might be. And I've had to really learn to step more powerfully into who I am. But I will say that, the writing voice is where it started. And then my
mhm.
speaking voice developed as a teacher. And then it's where it is today.
That's so interesting because I feel like with your authentic voice, it seems like you came to it in similar the way I did later in my careers. Like I had to go through certain things to kind of
Mhm.
get to a place where I can kind of say like, I don't care what people think. You know what I mean? And you can
Yeah,
kind of step into kind of like your power. And that's when you can kind of start incorporating things from your heritage and being Asian American and being a woman. And you can do without being so scared of kind of how it's going to be received. And that's such an interesting thing to come into as like being an entrepreneur because we each have such unique backgrounds, but sometimes in the beginning you're kind of taught not to put that in the forefront, you know what I mean, to
for
kind of
sure.
hide it.
Oh yeah, and I feel like I still feel that way sometimes, right? Like I think
Mhm,
that, especially I think being Asian American women, we can
mhm,
be still in this category of like acceptable,
mhm,
for like the larger white
mhm.
population,
Right,
and then it's like, but it's and then your culture is just like little pieces of like cool, like it makes you cool and interesting because
right,
you have like background, but then underneath that though, like you're still a person of color, and then you've
right.
still had these experiences and things where people were diminishing to you because of what you look like, and so it's sort of this interesting layer of like where do you get like giving yourself permission? And this is a big thing I've had to learn of
Mhm,
giving myself permission to be able to just speak frankly.
mhm,
And I will say too, though, like I also notice where sometimes I do edit myself a little bit
mhm,
when I'm not around necessarily other people of color because it's just not a conversation I want to have. And I
mhm,
think it's always something I feel like I'm really on a journey with it still. It's like, where do I share? Where do I not share? How
mhm,
much do I want to share? Because there is just fundamentally some stuff that's going to be particular to my own experience that people who are not like me are just not going to be able to understand because it's just the way it is. But I'm curious how it has been for you. Like, what and I'm curious actually about your journey too when you were in the corporate world and
mhm,
what you noticed about owning your voice and even probably to leave and
mhm,
what it's like for you now.
mhm. I think because I was in the corporate world, I'm in a few different contexts. One, like running a department, um, a buying department, and also being an executive at kind of food startups, the very West Coast, very tech startups. I think you were rewarded more if you were able to create an internal narrative that was palatable and also that was very showy. And
Mm,
I think for me, I always struggled with being showy because that's not normal to my personality, one. And also, I think as an Asian American woman, we aren't always, I don't know the right way to say it exactly, but we kind of feel more comfortable if we're more polite and we're more accepted and we're not aggressive and we don't speak our mind. So I think that's where I had to come to say, like, how do I still be myself, but still be straightforward and still be honest and authentic within this corporate world? And it's not easy. And I think it took me a long time to be able to be more straightforward, but still do it in a way that felt like it was me. Like I wasn't trying to act like aggressive for someone or, be a straight shooter, be like a shark. People said, be more like a shark. And I was like, well, that's, you know what I mean? I think you should still be who you are
mhm.
and find that voice. But in leaving the corporate world, I kind of realized like you don't have to be that way to succeed. And sometimes being the person who asks the most questions and listens and tries to create a relationship, I think that's more lasting sometimes than being like the aggressive shark.
Totally. And I would say I really relate to what you're saying because it's
Mhm.
sometimes people are like, okay, be this way,
Yeah.
which I think typically is like a white male way
Yes. Yes.
to succeed. And
Right.
then there's another layer of that, but like that's sort of like the standard.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
then there's this level of like, how do you balance
Hmm.
also for me culturally the same way? Like I was literally always the kid at the back of the room who did their homework and never talked.
Hmm.
Like, classic
Yeah.
quiet Chinese American kid. And it was like I'm a younger sister too, so I think all of
Mhm.
those things played into
Me
it,
too.
and so I just, like, never spoke up, and
Mhm.
then the older I got, there are certain times that benefits me, like, I
Mhm.
am a coach and I have really great listening skills, I
Mhm.
feel like because of some of that,
Mhm.
and you have great observational skills when you're never talking, like, you can see
Mhm.
what everybody else is saying and what they're doing, but
Mhm.
then there's this side at which it becomes a disadvantage, and then is it actually you? Is it
Mhm.
just what you've learned culturally?
Right.
Is it serving you, right? Like all of those pieces come together. And, I'm in some groups that are really big, like calls
Mhm.
that'll be like 100 people. And I had to train myself to literally just
Yeah.
raise my hand all the time and not to be loud and express an opinion, but just to ask a question,
Right.
just to be able to like get what I came for. And the only way to get what I came for is to raise my hand. I was in an event in New York last week, and for whatever reason, I usually like to get there early and sit in the front now, like instead of the
Mhm.
back. And I didn't do that. And I ended up on a table that was kind of in the back. And then for the first half of this event, I found myself being very passive. I was like
Mhm.
falling back into that old pattern of being quiet in the back of the room.
Mhm.
And I was like, and I didn't even want to I didn't raise my hand. And it was like 40, 50 people.
Mhm.
And so I actually they had us change tables halfway through the day and I made myself sit in front and then made myself like raise my hand again. Cause again, that was going to be how I got what I came for, which was to
Right.
ask questions, to get coached and to get worked on. But it's interesting how easy, like it was interesting for me to see how quickly I fell back into that old way that I had learned as a kid. And I'm kind of curious if that is similar for you or what have noticed about your own patterns with that.
No, I love what you say got what you came for because I think how I was in the corporate world, when I was in a meeting that was a bit bigger, I would say, you know what, I'll wait till after the meeting and then I'll go ask the question. And I think, and I've talked to a lot of people who say do the same thing. Like they don't want to speak in the wider group and then they end up missing asking the question or making the connection or speaking about something, an idea they have that they're really passionate about. I would always say, like, well, I'll tell the idea like afterwards and
Right.
I'll talk to them. And then you kind
Yeah.
of miss your opportunity. And um I think that for me, it was a little bit. partially because of like how I grew up with how you don't want to put yourself out there. You kind of just want to, do your work and do everything kind of like properly like that. But I think more so, I think it was a fear of people thinking that like they don't understand you, right? So
Mm-hmm.
for me, it was kind of coming to a point where I was like, I think I have a different point of view. So if you have a different idea or a question that's like kind of out of the box, it's okay. That people are like, oh, that's kind of, out of the box question or idea.
Well, and I wonder sometimes too if it's more subtle than that, that we didn't want to stand out because we already stood out.
Yeah. That's that's interesting because I think you had the same kind of background as I did.
Hmm.
I grew up in Florida, in Tampa, so it was like very predominantly white suburb. And I think for a while is I almost kind of rejected being Asian American because I just wanted to kind of fit in. And I almost kind of said to myself, like, why would I want to hang out with Asian people and hang out with them just because they're Asian? Like, I'm going to hang out with people because I do a sport with them or I do this club with them and or I'm friends with them. So I think in some ways I kind of purposely rejected it because I didn't want to be the stereotypical Asian person. And I think in a lot of ways it kind of hurts you from just realizing you should be friends with who you want to be and be who you are, and people are still going to really accept you.
Totally, yeah, and I definitely grew up that way too, and it's hard because you just don't you struggle with, like, what part of your culture do you embrace, what p do you
Hmm.
reject, like,
Hmm.
I remember, I didn't wanna be like all the other Chinese kids who played tennis and played violin, and then I played tennis and played violin, like, it was really funny, and I had this, like, resistance to it,
Hmm.
but then those were things I gravitated toward, like, I
Hmm.
did like playing the violin, and I was really good at tennis, and so I did
Hmm.
that too, but it was like, I
Hmm.
didn't wanna be but in my head, I was like, "Well, I'm doing it, but I'm not the stereotype." Like,
Right,
I
right, right, right.
myself of that, but it was sort of funny because, yeah, I wanted to fit in, and I was like, "Gosh, why didn't my mom put me in, like, soccer or softball? Like, those are the cool sports when you're in high school, the acceptable sports." And, like, tennis was fine. It's not like tennis
Mhm.
wasn't cool, but it just didn't have that same cachet, right? And it's interesting how you, like, try so hard to like, it's just this, um, tension and, like, it's like
Mhm.
tacky, like, you're just being pulled back and forth of, like, how can I be acceptable? How can I be, really how can I be what other people think is cool? But
Mhm.
then there's the part of you that, like, I wanted to achieve, like, I wanted to do well in school. I wanted to get good grades, and I was in, like, all kinds of sports and activities. And when you're a kid, it's really hard, that tension. So I think you're like, I don't want to stand out. I only want to stand out, like, in the right ways
Mhm.
and not in any other way.
Mhm.
And then you get into the corporate world and they're like, "Oh, you need to stand out in all the ways
Yeah.
to actually make it," right?
Can I ask you, did you find like that kind of balance between standing out and also being reserved because of like who we are as Asian American women? Have you always felt like that has been an issue for you in your personal life and corporate life, or did you find a balance faster in your personal life than your corporate life for
I
you?
mean, that's such a good question. I feel like it's still both. I mean, I
Right.
think it was really both for me and, like, oh my gosh, how long do you have today, Mary Beth, for me to talk about all of these things? Because, I think ultimately, like, I think about my friends have always been pretty diverse,
Right.
actually, and not just like Chinese American or Asian American, but like just, I had South Asian friends and, like, other people from a lot of different cultures were actually
Mhm.
who I ended up being friends with in high school
Mhm.
and then in college. But then I was in the journalism world, and again, I was, like, sort of diverse and dependent.
Mhm.
But then I ended up in the yoga world, which is really white. And so then
Mhm.
all of a sudden I felt like my whole world was shifting to this, like, very predominantly
That's
white
interesting.
place. And it's just because of who I was around,
Right.
Like, I often would just, like, check in on myself, like, what do you want? Like, where is your culture? Like, how can you be present with your culture, and are you, like, pushing it away? But I
Mhm.
also spent time in China, like, I lived in Wuhan, China for a year, and, like, I spent time in Taiwan with my family, and so it's, like, this constant, like, again, like, this pull. Like, when I was in college, I had so many, like, identity breakdown crises, I would say, and I feel like that's probably pretty common, like, in your
Mhm.
high school, college years, and then after I went to China, and I was like, "Okay, I'm definitely not this, like, this is
Mhm.
not who I am, it's so foreign to me."
Mhm.
Taiwan is closer for me, like, because I have family there, and I grew up more with it, but
Mhm.
then I really came to the conclusion back then, like, that I am Taiwanese American, and,
Mhm.
like, just that identity worked for me to have both.
Mhm.
But I do think, especially in my own life, I have to it's weird because I think it's weird to have to say it, but I have to be really intentional about reaching out to people of color to
Mhm.
make sure that my world is as diverse and rich as I want it to be. Because I think it's
Mhm.
very easy to kind of fall into a place where my friend groups and my career groups are not as diverse as I want them to be.
Mhm.
I'm curious about your experience.
It's really interesting for me too because I think growing up, it was in Florida. It was really easy to keep like the Asian group separate than like my white friends in high school, um, because I went to predominantly white high school. And then when I went to college, it was the first time I was around more minorities, and I actually felt like I stood out more because I said to myself, I felt more like, oh, I don't really fit in here because I don't want to be friends with you just because you're Asian and I'm Asian. So I had kind of a little bit of a crisis where I had to say, oh, as the diversity in my group is expanding, I don't need to push back against it so much. I can
Mm.
kind of, you know what I mean? You just kind of accepted it more. So I think my personal life in college and my early 20s is when I was really able to uh, have the wholeness of being an Asian American person and having a diverse group of friends and feeling really comfortable in that. I felt more comfortable. It was more in the workplace I felt that it was harder to find that balance. And even like you're saying, go back into the wellness world in my now that I'm older, it is predominantly, for affluent white women. So it's like, how do you reach back out and make sure you're not losing a diverse group that you're reaching out to and being intentional about your choices?
Totally. And I think it's actually something that's like a never ending kind of a
Mhm.
thing, honestly. Cause like I remember, cause I would say that in my high school, it was like 20% black, very tiny portion Asian, and then
Mhm.
white. And
Okay.
then I recognized, and I grew up outside of Chicago. So like that's a big part of it. And then I moved to the West Coast where it's like much more white and Asian. And so it was interesting to me, like for me during Black Lives Matter in 2020, like I had a big reckoning of like, what are my groups looking like what who are the people I'm spending time with and why does it look the way that it does, and then really starting to recognize I had to be much more proactive to have the kind of diversity around myself that I actually really desired. And then whether it's personal and professionally, both
Mhm.
ways. And so I would say now, like and I did this too. I was the chair of a board, Yoga Behind Bars, for several years, and one of our goals was 50% of our board was BIPOC, and it was a nonstop, full on, year round effort. Like the
Yeah.
people who worked with me on recruitment on that board, and anyone who's listening who's ever been a nonprofit board member probably knows what it's like. But it was so, so, so much work.
And as you kind of started reaching out, because I think now that I'm new as an entrepreneur, I'm kind of doing the same thing that I think you kind of already went through. How does it change your approach to wellness when you start working with a more diverse group? Because I think wellness is so different for minorities because I think they weren't raised with really thinking about self care as much, as a whole. A lot of women I spoke with when I was doing research for my business said, like, especially women of colors, we didn't really think about wellness growing up. We were just kind of taught to suck it up and, especially being an Asian American, like don't complain, don't say anything about it. So, I think about that as well. And I was wondering how you kind of dealt with being a coach and, writing, if you're writing towards people of color as well, being more inclusive, how does it affect, your point of view?
It's interesting because because I came from yoga and I was doing that for so long. I mean, I went to yoga in like 2011.
Mm,
And so when I think about it, I have been in the world where like self-care and wellness is the priority for a really long time. And
mhm,
so I don't know that I went to yoga thinking of it that way. Like I just went to it as like a way to move my body. And
mm,
then just being in that world, it taught me, like you inevitably are paying attention to your food and your diet, how you feel, because the whole goal of yoga is like that internal looking. So I feel like in certain ways it's hard for me to say because I feel like it just kind of got trained out of me not to take care of myself.
mhm,
Like even if that was how I always existed before, and I don't know that I ever necessarily thought of it as cultural, even though I'm sure when I look around, like at my mom, like she didn't necessarily do things like that
mhm,
herself either. But yeah, like I don't know, yoga really taught me to prioritize my own health and well-being,
mhm,
and it's been like more than a decade of that. So I don't feel like I have a great answer for what you're asking on that. But I do think in general, though, I think a lot of women and women of color in general struggle more because they're taught that they have to work harder to get the same things. And I
mhm.
think that's the piece that really undermines them, not self-care so much, but the idea that they have to work twice as hard to get the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's like a double because I think women in general, they don't, especially they get busy through their lives, they don't prioritize themselves. And speaking to so many women, they don't put a ritual in their day that's just for themselves, whether it be like 5 minutes or, 30 minutes or taking a class, something even really quick. And I think women of color even feel sometimes more so. I think we're taught to work so hard and to kind of burn ourselves out sometimes in the corporate world, like which happens so much. Um, and is like really creating like more women and women of color creating spaces where women can feel comfortable to say like I can give myself the time and feel like I have a community of like really supportive people around me that kind of, understand and so you don't feel guilty doing it, or you know what I mean? You feel like you can really incorporate into your life.
Yeah, and how do you in terms of, like, because your whole company is really around this, like, ritual practices, like,
Mhm.
how do you think about teaching and supporting women? And I don't know if you're necessarily focused on women of color per se, but, like, teaching women how to actually bring in the component of taking care of themselves.
Yeah, I think like you're saying, like I didn't go into it to target women of color. It was just from my personal experience saying, I was just burning out from the corporate world. My health wasn't in the best place because I wasn't giving myself space. So how do I reset? How do I make sure every morning I meditate? I either have a bowl of matcha cacao, I do something intentional. And I show gratitude in the morning. And when I started the company, I just was like, who else needs this? And I just started talking to my immediate group of friends who were, my very diverse group of women. And I found a lot of them need it, but a lot of women, especially women of color, they don't have time. So for me, it was about how do I find something that is really quick? For me, having a bowl of matcha or cacao or a matcha cacao snack, something that you can do that's less than 10 minutes. I think a lot of women were looking for something like that. So it was kind of